Hey everybody, chapter 31 here. We're going to be looking at, well, the next three chapters, the last three chapters, are all basically 1945 until present. We'll be looking at a very, very short summation of sort of some of the most significant world events that happen over this, 50, 60-year period, 67-year period, actually. This one will be looking at a little bit Soviet Union, the Cold War, sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union, things like that. It should actually be a shorter section, just letting you know. The division of Europe. In this section, we're going to look at the next 50, actually closer to like 60, 70 years, East-West Europe, global division between the West and the East, what we come to call the West and the East. The West, which is primarily what we think of as Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, and a few other allied regions of countries in the world. And then the East is primarily, during the Cold War, it's really the Soviet Union, primarily, and the Soviet Union's allies. The origins of this Cold War. It's called a Cold War because no more nuclear weapons are used, and there's no major global conflicts. Don't get me wrong, there's wars. There's always wars, there's always conflicts, but there's nothing anywhere on a comparison like a world war. And again, no more nuclear weapons are used. We have the infamy of being the only country to actually use nuclear weapons on a population center. The post-war Potsdam Conference, it was the first meeting of the Big Three. This was in early 45. Pardon me, I'm thinking about the other one, Yalta. Yalta was early 45. This is late 45, sort of after, as the war is ending, and after Germany has surrendered. We have Truman now, who's president, because, of course, FDR died in April. So we have Truman. He's not as easygoing with the Soviets. We generally think Truman, being such a take such a hardline tactic with the Soviets, is because he had the bomb now, and no one else had the bomb, and so he didn't think he had anything to fear from the Soviets. It was several years before they developed it, so he was basically very, very unforgiving with the Soviets and wasn't willing to negotiate with them in any way. He expected them to sort of just fall in line because he had the bomb. And of course we have Churchill, Prime Minister Churchill, who was a national hero in England. And then, of course, the leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin. We were the big three allies during the war. Although, truthfully, during the war, primarily the only ones to work together jointly was the U.S. and England. The Soviets were working by themselves most of the time for different reasons, which I'm not going to get into right now. Truman demanded free, unfettered elections, which means unfettered, which means not complicated, with no strings attached, without anyone looking over their shoulders. Basically, free elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin refused, didn't want that. He knew that if these free elections occurred, we would get democratic, un-communist governments, and he wanted a buffer zone. The Soviets had, in both World War I and World War II combined, the country that lost the most population were the Soviets. They were responsible for almost half of the actual fatalities in the two wars combined. His refusal to allow free elections in Eastern Europe, again, he wanted this buffer, because the Soviets had taken so many losses, and they had. I mean, it is true, but at least half of the losses in the two wars were basically Soviets. But of course it was a power thing too. It was about power and remaining in power and the expansion of the Soviet Union. Don't get me wrong on that. But anyway, he wanted this buffer zone in case there was another world war. But it really, with the buffer zone, wasn't necessarily against the Germans. It was to us. It was a buffer between the East and the West. He wanted protections from Western powers, which he knew didn't like him, didn't like communism, and wanted democratic governments, democratic representative governments, not the authoritarian government which he was running. The authoritarian, basically, I don't know what you want to call it, autocracy, I guess would be the right word. This is often considered to be the precipitating cause of the Cold War, his refusal to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. He doesn't allow it. The Soviet tanks and military, which moved in during the war to push out the Germans, stayed for the next 50 years. Basically, the Soviet Union moved into Eastern Europe. These were still technically independent countries, but they really were de facto Soviet satellites, countries run and taking marching orders from the Soviet Union for the next half century. This keeps us constantly on edge of nuclear oblivion for the rest of that century. This becomes West versus East. This is the Iron Curtain, a figurative term referring to this Iron Curtain which drops, which the Soviet Union and about 12 countries were behind this Soviet, or what is sometimes referred to as the Soviet sphere of influence, which is Eastern Europe, which is really a huge amount of territory because the Soviet Union itself was almost a dozen countries. Basically, it's a union of Soviet socialist republics. It is a union of about 12 different regions and 12 different territories, Russia being the big one, but a bunch of other small countries which are part of the Soviet Union. And then you have about another dozen countries in Eastern Europe, which are now under the Soviet sphere. So we have 20 plus countries that are all now either in the Soviet Union or associated, allied under the direction of the Soviet Union. And that's just in Europe. That doesn't include their allies globally, places like Cuba and things like this. So, it's actually quite a lot. Okay, so many people are concerned about communism, exporting communism around the globe. This is what was our biggest concern. During the Cold War, our fear was that communism would spread across the world, which it actually does sort of do that. And Truman issues the doctrine. The doctrine is nothing more than a statement of purpose. It has no actual power of law, but basically it is a statement indicating that the U.S. government will do this without any actual technical power of law. And this doctrine is about the idea that we will assist anyone in the world against communism, or anyone attempting to take over their country by some outside power, or internal power. Anyone who basically is trying to take over a government from externally or internally, other than the freely elected government or freely chosen government. We will basically, and our target is communism here. We make it more of a blanket statement, but everyone knows we mean communism. We will go anywhere in the world to defend against communism, call, and the U.S. soldiers will come and assist. We will give money. We will give military aid to do this, to basically fight a global war to stop the spread of communism. That's really sort of the core of the U.S.'s policy during the Cold War, which gets us into conflict after conflict and costs the lives of millions upon millions of people around the world, believing that we are trying to save the world from communism, which is a just cause. Communism's bad. It's not a great way to run a country in any way, but we often get ourselves into a lot of problems globally in our intent to try and do better and try to do good, to try to protect the population of the world. Yeah. Let's see. The Truman Doctrine states it will support anyone resisting communism. We also do the Marshall Plan. Congress institutes the Marshall Plan in 1948. It's a response to Soviet control in Eastern Europe. We offer billions of dollars, several $billion. I think altogether, you don't have it in my notes. I'm trying to think what the number is. It's billions. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's billions of dollars we offer to Europe to help them rebuild after the war. And anyone who wants the money has to have the agreement to have free elections, these free and unfettered elections that we wanted. Hoping that we could maybe get some countries to maybe pull away from the Soviet Union, and of course to make allies among our European countries to make them friendly to the U.S. And we do offer billions of dollars to help them rebuild. Many people realize that one of the things that caused World War II was the inability for some European countries to recover from World War I. Italy, Germany, for instance. And we believe that this is one of the good things we can do by putting our money where our mouth is, to help try and install democratic governments, to try and help free elections, to also make these countries friendly to us. And we offer this money to Eastern Europe, and Stalin won't accept it. These Eastern European countries don't accept it either because they're told to not accept it, because they had to basically pull away from the Soviet Union and pull to the West if they wanted the money, and the Soviets would not allow that. so it doesn't really happen. And as a result, we see like there's a lot of research done in the 80s before the Cold War ends that you can see countries in Western Europe that are modern, 1980s modern technology, culture, and many parts in Eastern Europe still look like the 1940s and 50s. Literally, Eastern Europe was left 30 years behind the rest of the world, the rest of the industrial world, with technology, infrastructure, education, access to goods and medicine, and 100 other things. Basically, he left Eastern Europe almost like frozen in time, to where by the 1970s and 80s, people couldn't even buy toilet paper. Like it was impossible to buy. Even the most simple, basic goods that we take for granted in Western society, people could not get. They couldn't get food. They couldn't get clean water. It was, it was terrible. And this is basically Eastern Europe stagnates while the rest of the modern industrial world moves forward. Concerned the Soviet Union is becoming an aggressor state, the Western allies develop NATO, which is very, very important, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. North Atlantic meaning basically America, Europe, although it is expanded around the globe later. It is primarily European countries in the United States. And it is a mutual defense treaty. Basically, we will protect ourselves against any attack on a NATO nation is an attack on all NATO nations. Like today, currently, there's like 32. I don't know what the number was initially. Any attack on one of those countries is an attack on all the countries. And the idea is to keep you from, you might single out one person to get in a fight with, but you're going to pick a fight with 32 people that all have tanks, planes, and bombs. I mean, that's the idea. Immediately, the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact, which is their version of a mutual defense treaty of Soviet allies. So by 1949-1950, basically the board is set for the Cold War, East versus West, NATO versus Warsaw Pact, and this leads us into lots of mini global proxy wars globally over the entire rest of the century. Korean War is the first proxy war. What is a proxy war? A war is a war in its most simple, and this isn't probably a technical definition, but to make you understand it's most simple, it's a war between East and West where the U.S. and the Soviet Union don't actually fight a technical battle. There's actually no technical war between the U.S. and the Soviets because we know that shit's bad. That's going to involve global warfare, nuclear weapons, and basically global catastrophe. So the U.S. and the Soviets can't technically go to war with each other because it would basically destroy everything. We know this. No one wants a World War III. No matter how much the East and West hate each other, neither side want a World War III. But we do fight these mini wars all over the globe. Whether it's Korea or Vietnam or Afghanistan or a dozen other places, we fight these little mini conflicts in different regions of the world that are heavily supported on one side by the West and heavily supported on the other side by the East. Korea is the first one. Korean War, 1950, 1953. My grandfather fought in this war. I thought that's relevant, but I like to say it. Proxy war, West versus East, West versus communism to try and stop the expansion of communism. Let's see, we have China was also included in this. We have Chinese communist aggression into North Korea. Basically, the Chinese were assisting North Korea in an attempt to control all of Korea to turn it into a communist state. The Soviets had conquered Korea in World War II, had taken it away from the Japanese, and the Chinese and the Soviets were partners. I'm not going to say they were friendly. Chinese communism and Soviet communism, they didn't get along, and there was a rivalry there and competition, and they weren't exactly friends, but they were both sort of common interest of communism, both communist against the West. And so they did cooperate in many ways, militarily being one. So we see Chinese and Soviets helping North Korea, which becomes communist, to try and take over and conquer South Korea. This ends up getting into a war which lasts several years. Eventually, a treaty is signed, and basically we end up with two Koreas, North and South Korea. Ironically, maybe that's not the right word. It's not. Let's forget ironic. Just today we have a North Korea, which is a communist, totalitarian state that is what is some consider the most oppressive government on the entire world. And then you have South Korea, which is a very democratic or quasi-democratic liberal culture society, which is a very strong ally of the United States. One of our number one allies in Europe, or pardon me, in Asia. But yes, it does eventually end with a 50% victory. We saved half the country. We end up getting a South Korea, which we saved, and North Korea, which goes totally to the dark side, if you will. That's often the way it was. We rarely ever had an outright victory against communism. Almost every time it was a half victory, a partial victory, and usually coming at great loss of life and often international standing of our country. I could spend a while, like in a U.S. history course, I'd spend like 20 minutes talking about the Korean War. I won't be doing that here. You can have a look at the map for a minute if you want. But it does eventually, we do end up saving half of Korea, treaty signed, and we get a relatively democratic southern state, South Korea, versus what is a heavily authoritarian North Korea, which is a very dangerous world power today. Very unpredictable and dangerous. Constantly threatening South Korea. Even had to create this, what is considered to be one of the most dangerous places in the entire world. The DMZ, the demilitarized zone here, which is full of landmines. One of the most beautiful places in the world today. That's because no one can go there. There's literally hundreds of thousands of mines. The entire DMZ is just covered in mines everywhere to basically make it impossible for either country to invade the other country. And so there's basically no human interaction in the entire DMZ. And so it's a very beautiful area. Just you can't go there. You can only view it from a distance. It would be death to try and cross unless you were incredibly lucky. There are a few official places. There's a few official spots where you can cross, of course, for whatever reason, but yeah. NATO members, we see NATO members here, England, Norway. This is this shows 1950s. Portugal, Spain joins in 82. We just recently had some changes to this. Recently having some changes to Ukraine may join eventually. What Sweden and Finland are joining or have just joined. And the reason they did is because of Ukraine. Sweden and Finland finally joined after remaining neutral for almost all this period of time because they believed Russia today was going to do the same thing with them they were going to do with Ukraine. If Sweden and Finland didn't join NATO, they believed that one day it would be Soviet tanks rolling into their country trying to take them over just the way they've done in Crimea and in Ukraine, been doing in the last 10 years. So we've got several countries that are hopping on the NATO bandwagon today out of fear of the Russian aggression, which is it's really crazy. Talk about history repeating itself. It's almost like all the shit's happening over again, where the Russians are, you can watch and keep up with current events if you want. We're not going to go any further in that. And you see the Iron Curtain here, which is entirely a metaphor. It's not like a literal thing. It's a metaphor for the idea of this wall separating East versus West. Communist countries, unaligned countries, and then the Marshall Plan. Most Western European countries participate because they want that money. We get billions of dollars to help them rebuild. And I didn't really even talk about Berlin. We get West Berlin, which is Western, and we get East Berlin, which is under the Soviets. Really interesting because it's actually in the East. So that becomes problematic. Basically, we have a Western allied part of a city actually behind the Iron Curtain. That's complicated. I'm not going to discuss that right at the moment. All right. Renaissance and crisis in Western Europe, the changing class structure, social reforms. The economy improves, Europe recovers in the 50s and 60s. We see a large new middle class. Western Europe becomes one of the most prosperous places in the world. Simply put, it becomes modernized, technological, it becomes great standard of living. Western Europe becomes one of the best places to live on the globe. It simply does. And a large part is because of the peace that is brought by NATO and the peace that is brought by American intervention, American military, and American money. And no more world wars and no more real wars. There's no real major conflicts fought in Western Europe ever again, really. And so, yeah, after decades and decades, much of the first half of the century in misery, the Depression, World War I, World War II, we end up becoming a very, very good area. A good place to live, high standard of living, some of those prosperous nations on the planet, and most of them are democratic or social democratic and basically more representative governments. Greater incomes, greater independence, greater job opportunities, greater educational choices, and basically Western and Northern Europe become the best places to live in the world. Best education, best standard of living, most happiness generally. There is actually a research done every year, some type of international questionnaire that basically talks about the happiness level of all the countries in the world. Where I don't know how many people are, I don't know how it's polled, I haven't idea anything about it, but this is considered to be one of the happiest places on earth, Western and especially Northern Europe, over the rest of the century. We see all kinds of new social reforms. In much of Western Europe sort of becomes what many of these places are now called. Many countries in Europe are now known as social democracies, which is the idea of a democracy which really puts a lot of effort and energy and money into the well-being of its citizens. The U.S. was on its way to being a social democracy in the mid-20th century, and then we put brakes on that. We still do a lot, and we still did a lot, but we don't ever really go to a full social democracy because we still have such a strong view of capitalism and such a fear of communist socialism. Yeah. We don't ever fully go that. We don't really fully go that way. All kinds of new social reforms, unemployment benefits, pensions, Social Security, public housing, all kinds of state programs. All these expensive programs by heavy taxes, extraordinary amount of debt, and modern welfare state. And America and England both do this. We don't go as far here in this country as some others. Some other countries, much of Western Europe and Northern Europe today, have entirely free healthcare for all, free education. A couple of these countries have basically free education. We have definitely not gone that direction. We went halfway, and then we sort of stopped as a country. This does create modern welfare states in Europe and the United States to varying degrees. John Bull Magazine, January 1957. All right. Over decades of violence and economic upheaval, the Depression, World War I, World War II, what in this illustration might people treasure now after the war? This is the next decade. The war is over. What is it people value in this image? Look at it. And I'm going to tell you, I want you to look at it and think about it. Think about all the issues that we had, all the unemployment, all the strife, all the want, all the warfare, all the violence, all the killing. Everything that European, this is a European magazine. I believe it's a European magazine. Yeah, I'm almost positive it is. Think about all the things that had been missing or hard to come by or problematic. The World War I, World War II, the soldiers going away, the families separated, the unemployment, the rationing, the warfare, the violence. Think about all the ways this is opposite of that. How much in this image really hits middle-class people and tells them, this is good. This is what we want. Think about that. There's a lot of things in here. I'm not going to list them because I'm going to make a discussion question out of this. Now, admittedly, they're all white. And that's a valid point to be made. I don't know if it applies to my point. Because regardless of the actual ethnicity of the people, the good things that were happening in Europe, which, don't get me wrong, primarily white, Europe, Western Europe, all of Europe is almost exclusively white, 90% white population. But be thinking about how these things are good for everybody. What the advantages are of not having the constant strife, want, need, violence, warfare, killing, social, political upheavals, all of the riots and the protests and the uprisings and the unrest, all the things that we see in Europe for much of the 20th century up until after World War II. Think about how this was things people wanted and what they liked and what they felt were good about society in the 1950s. All the things about this that would make you feel like, I would like to be there, or I think that is better than what I had in decades before. And yeah, I could talk about so many different things in here, but I want to leave it open for you to look at it and think about it and analyze it. Now, there's obviously some sexist stuff in this, obviously some sexist and stereotypes in this, and this is an idyllic image. It's meant to be the great, wonderful image, admittedly. But even foregoing that, it does represent a lot of the realities of the 1950s. It does represent a lot of the new, better things. Even if life isn't perfect for everybody, of course not. It does represent a lot of the good things that were happening in this time period as opposed to the previous generation. Yep, you can think about the kids, the wife, the husband, employment, education, the home, the clothing, the looks on their faces, the idea of the prosperity, the idea of having money and incomes and security, owning a house. There's just so many things. And I don't know if I'll include this as part of the question when I do it, but think about what the meaning of this. Woman at the wheel. What's the implication of that with the woman here cooking? What does that mean? And again, is that also by our modern... don't look at it by our... That's another thing I want to say. Don't look at this by our modern standards. Don't look at it out of time. Look at it as of if you were a person in the 50s. Don't look at it from today's time period and look at it and think about the things about it that are perhaps patronizing or sexist. Look at it as how people would have seen this in the 1950s, or the kind of emotions it might have brought out in folks in this time period. So think about history. You have to not be anachronistic, meaning you can't look at it outside of time. You have to look at it within the time period. Don't evaluate it by our standards, evaluate by the standards of the 50s. Think about that. Okay, Stalin Europe, 1945, 1991. In this section, we're going to sort of look at communism, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, how it develops all the way through basically the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. Stalin's last years. In an effort to reestablish his power over the Soviet people, Stalin began to eliminate elements that might undermine his authoritarian dictatorship, with his goal, of course, being anti-West, anti-capitalist. He purged thousands of citizens, returning soldiers. He revived the gulags, which are the prison camps, prison labor camps. He purged art and culture, Western influence, book burnings. Christians and Soviet Jews came under regular attack. The Soviet government tried to see itself, it really was, as basically a non-religious entity. We talk about in the U.S. the idea of separation of church and state. That's not in the Constitution, and we do not have separation of church and state in this country. Don't for a moment fool yourself and think we do. It's not. The Christian church is part and parcel of the United States government. It is in every way. So, yeah, we have the exact opposite of separation of church and state. Church is heavily written into our laws and our society in this country. And the reason I'm saying that is because the Soviets do have it. The Soviets have separation of church and state. Religion really has nothing to do with their society, their governing. It really has nothing to do with communism and their governing. Many Americans often thought of the Soviets as atheist. And the government really was. They did have the separation of church and state, and so they really were not very sympathetic towards Christians or Jews. Much of the Soviet population was Christian, at least half, if not more, were openly Christian, although they often weren't the version we're familiar with, Protestant or even Catholic. Most of them would have been Eastern Orthodox, which is a break-off of Christianity from centuries before. Most of them would have been what we think of as Eastern Orthodox Christians. So Christians were persecuted, especially Western Christians, Western versions, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant Christians would often have been attacked, even purged, taken to the prison camps. Stalinist system of this totalitarian government was exported to Eastern Europe nations. This is all under the Iron Curtain. We see basically most of these Eastern European countries come to copy the Soviet model of communism. They were all under Soviet control. It was primarily nationalized industry, which means government controlled by the nation. Not much private property, private industry. It was anti-capitalist, which is all about private business, private property. So this was the polar opposite of capitalism, at least as far as an economic system. Lots of tax on religion and culture. We basically see a very small middle class, almost non-existent, which again is the opposite of capitalism. In Western countries and the U.S., we see capitalist middle class expand dramatically. The majority of American people would fall within that middle class range by this time period of the 50s, while Soviet Union, it was a very small percentage. The vast majority of people in the Soviet Union, like 80-90%, lived in poverty, with a small, less than 10% middle class, and then a very small elite at the top, which is primarily composed of party officials and military officials. Same kind of thing we see today in, say, like China or in North Korea. The elite at the top are primarily party officials, government officials, and military officials, while the rest of the population is left to basically just get by. Nikita Khrushchev takes power in the 50s. Stalin dies in 1953. We see a Soviet civil war instituted for a couple years. Khrushchev doesn't take over. I don't have it in my notes, but I think Khrushchev takes over in 56. So I believe we have about 3 years of internal civil war, internal strife, of which the Soviet Union doesn't collapse. It's simply a power struggle to see who's going to lead the party and who's going to be in charge. And finally, one does rise to the top, Khrushchev, who takes over as the leader of the Communist Party in 1956, which is also the leader of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was sort of faltering in many ways. There was all kinds of problems economically. They were declining economically. They were having a hard time paying for their military, which was their largest expenditure of their government was the military. So was the U.S. The largest single expenditure in the U.S. was military in this time period. In some years, two-thirds of the entire U.S. budget was military, or was known as national defense. The difference is, we had a much larger pool of money to pull from. We had a much wealthier, affluent nation, a much higher tax base, and therefore we had simply put, even that 1/3 that was left over for all of the other government programs was probably way more than the entire Soviet budget. So even though we put 2/3 of our money into the national defense, that 1/3 that was left was still bigger than probably the GDP of most countries in the world. Because we were an economic powerhouse, and really nothing comparable to anyone else in the world. But then we had everything going for us. We were the only country not decimated, really, by the World War as far as modern industrial nations. So we had everything going for us. So Khrushchev has to make all kinds of changes and reforms to basically deal with a potentially uprising of his own society. Lots of peasants upset, lots of poor people upset. Of course, lagging behind the rest of the world militarily, industrially, technologically. So he changes a lot of things. He changes a lot of things, a lot of reforms. This is often referred to as this de-Stalinization. He also does something, and this is another why this is called this. He actually does something really surprising. Once he comes to power, he admonishes, criticizes, and basically talks about how terrible Stalin was, the previous leader of the party, and says Stalin was wrong, he was bad, he took the country in the wrong direction. He basically is criticizing and attacking his predecessor, who was by some Soviets thought of as a hero, which was really surprising to many people. He made economic reforms. We see him closing the gulags. He stops the purges. However, the Communist Party remained totally controlling. They managed to keep the Soviet Union in a tight grip. They remained total one-party control of society and control of most industries, all the important ones. We do see a handful, we do see some capitalism seep in this time period. We do see some reverse nationalization of some industries. I don't know if that's a proper term, but we do see some industries go back to privatization of some industries. Not a lot, but some. But usually the most important, significant industries, energy, oil, things like that, they were kept in the control of the government. They didn't want to let the most important things out of their control. The political power remains, and they also maintain control over Eastern Europe as best as possible. We do see, even in the 60s, we start seeing a few Eastern European countries have some little minor revolutions and revolts, trying to potentially throw off Soviet control. Really unsuccessful for the most part. It doesn't really start to make any change yet. But as I led into there, we do see Eastern European countries sort of trying to push off Soviet control, especially when they see Khrushchev come in, who has a much softer hand. Again, getting rid of the prison camps, getting rid of the purges, trying to take reforms, trying to privatize some industries, all in an attempt to basically modernize the Soviet Union and to put it more of an even playing field to try and catch up with the United States and the rest of the world. So we do see some attempted independence movements in Eastern Europe. Very few actually are really successful. Poland does get some independence. Hungary gets some independence. We see a liberal communist leader take over Hungary. It's kind of weird. We do see a liberal, it's still technically communist, but a lot more open to Western ideas take over. East Germany feels a lot of pressure and a lot of fear over the influence of West Germany, which is a Western following part of the city. And also there's a lot of people going in Eastern Europe that are basically going into Berlin to cross over to West Germany, and then they can fly to freedom. They can't get across Europe, but through all the military checkpoints and whatnot, but what they can do is get into Eastern Berlin, cross over to West Berlin, and then take a plane out and actually get out of Eastern Europe to more freedom, more free areas. And so the Soviets and the East Berlin, they build a wall. They actually build a wall. This is around 1961. Again, I don't have it on my notes either, but I think it's around 61. And they actually build the actual physical wall, the Berlin Wall, which comes to represent the actual Iron Curtain. To keep people from getting out, they line it with towers and machine guns and kill anyone crossing without permission. To basically separate the free from the oppressed. Well, the Soviet Union does exactly what we thought it would do, and it tries to expand around the world. It tries to expand its influence, tries to expand its authority, finds a friend with the Castros in Cuba, who eventually becomes Soviet, or eventually become communist. Let's see, Fidel Castro overthrows the Cuban government. He establishes communist rule. This happens in the mid-50s. He becomes an ally of Khrushchev. We actually try to invade, and it becomes really, really ugly. We actually try to not take over, but try to overthrow the communist Fidel Castro, or the Castro government. In 61, we try to do that, try to actually overthrow them. Yeah, I think 61, it's a huge mess. Under Kennedy, it was a disaster, the Bay of Pigs fiasco. I'll mention it again later. But the point of really this is the Soviets start to find allies around the world. We start to see other countries sort of communist leaning and communist friendly, because the Soviets promised them the same thing we promised countries. We'll give you weapons, we'll give you military, we'll give you money, we'll give you supplies, we'll defend you and protect you. You just have to become our friends. Of course, this was a huge issue, because this was 90 miles off our coast. Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. So it was a huge problem. We're trying to stop and protect the entire world from communism. We can't even stop communism from taking over an island spitting distance from us. I mean, how much of a slap is that to the United States and our military, national, international mission of stopping communism? We can't even protect and keep an island right off our coast that you can see with a pair of binoculars from Florida. Yeah. There you go. Khrushchev was seen as weak. He really was. Brezhnev takes over. I believe Brezhnev takes over. I don't know why I didn't put these stuff in my notes. I don't want to have these dates in there, so I'm just going by memory on that. 63, I think. I think Brezhnev takes over around 63. There's the Cuban Missile Crisis where the Soviets tried to put missiles in Cuba. The missile bases were already built. They were already building the rocket launching stations, and the Soviets were shipping over missiles, which could actually be armed with nuclear warheads, potentially. They would have been small, like, strategic missiles that could have shot and hit anywhere in the southern United States. They could have, with minutes' notice, they could have shot nuclear bombs into, these are small scale, much smaller, but they could have put nuclear warheads or even just regular ballistic missiles, which could, blow up lots of other things. They could have hit Florida all the way over to Texas. And so our spies found out about this, and we had a huge crisis, and some consider this the closest we came to war, because we forced the Soviets to turn around and take their missiles back instead of putting them in. This was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happens in 62. Khrushchev backs down, believing that Kennedy is going to use whatever force he has to use to protect and keep them from putting these terrible weapons right off our border. And as a result, it basically weakened his power, and he's replaced the following year by Brezhnev. Brezhnev takes over, I think, around 63. Brezhnev immediately starts a huge military buildup. It's what the Communist Party wanted. Now, is this what the communist citizens want? The communist citizens don't give a shit what's going on here. They're just trying to survive. They're just trying to feed their families. They're just working and laboring every single day in a poor country, all of them living in poverty, just trying to keep their heads down and trying to survive. But the Communist Party leadership really wants to show their power and their authority of building up a big military. And so Brezhnev immediately starts a massive buildup of the military. And basically, for we see the better part of a decade, the Soviet Union moving sort of away from military aggressiveness, generally, to a little more friendly approach to the West, which was headed in the right direction. Unfortunately, this was seen as weak by Soviet power in the Soviet Party, and the Communist Party removes Khrushchev and puts a hardliner, Brezhnev, in there, who has a very aggressive tactic. So generally, for the next 20 years, we see the Soviet Union becoming much, much more aggressive and more oppressive, and really more persecuting enemies, persecuting anyone of their own people who they think questions them. Yeah. There was a period there under Khrushchev where it looked like there might actually be some light at the end of the tunnel with the Soviets. And they got rid of him. They got rid of the one guy who actually might have actually got us into more of a friendly footing. And who knows? Had Khrushchev managed to hold on to power for 20 years, we might have seen the end of the Cold War. Who knows? There's no way to know. The Soviet Union might have fallen earlier. Or, hell, 1,000 other things could have happened. Anyway, let's look at the 80s. Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985, a couple years after Brezhnev dies. Again, we see another internal civil war conflict. This isn't like a major war, not like the American Civil War. It's nothing that like tears their country apart. But we see a lot of real internal struggles in the Soviet government after Brezhnev dies in the early 80s. It takes a couple years, and finally Gorbachev comes to power, who is, again, another more of a softliner. Someone who is much more soft and much more less aggressive than Brezhnev was. Comes to power in 85. His economic reforms, known as perestroika, which is what we call restructuring, reduces economic controls, increases the independence of some state enterprises. We see privatization of some industries, more free enterprise, corporations to actually have profits. We see basically what we could call a capitalistic communism. We have that today in the world. China. China is a capitalistic economy, capitalistic communist economy. it's not a traditional communism. It is a capitalistic communist society, government, economic system. And we have that here. Free enterprise, private business, economic controls, much more limited government controls. Glasnost is the other half of this new reforms under Gorbachev. We see the government becoming more open to the public. We see increased openness in the media. Glasnost meaning openness. We see some ending of censorship. We see the ending of some government propaganda. We actually see some free media. We actually see free non-government controlled media, non-state controlled media. The lies that have been spouted and the deception which have been spouted to people behind the Iron Curtain for 40 years, some of it starts to become revealed that, and some people come to realize they've been lied to their entire lives about how the rest of the world is. The West is not perfect. We screw things up too. Capitalism is deeply flawed. Democracy is flawed. As I mentioned before, that quote, I forget who even said the quote anymore, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. Democracy is flawed, but of all the options you got, it's the best one. So, yeah, we got our problems, but it's still 100 times better than living under a communist authoritarian regime. It's not even really comparable. Free speech, free expression for the first time in 70 years. We see more free political choices. His new political thinking on foreign affairs leads also into a military withdrawal from Eastern Europe, from Afghanistan. That was a proxy war, Afghanistan, between us and the Soviets. Afghanistan, again, not an officially declared war, but we spent years in Afghanistan basically fighting the Soviets. Just watch Rambo. So every time I think of it, I think of that movie, Rambo, I don't know which one it was, Rambo 2, Rambo 3, where he's basically standing there with a machine gun, taking on a Soviet attack helicopter, which can blow up tanks. And he's like standing there on the hill with the machine gun. I don't know, it's like probably an M60 or something like that. And he's, Rambo. It's quite an interesting movie. Yeah, it's, didn't win any Oscars. Nonetheless, we fought there in Afghanistan for most of the 1980s, late 70s and 80s, for a better part of a decade. Basically, it was a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviets over Afghanistan, which basically, I think, Afghanistan bordered the Soviet Union. Us supporting one side, them supporting the other side. It's really ironic. This is ironic. One of the people we supported in Afghanistan in the 1980s was Osama bin Laden. One of the people we gave all kinds of money to, weapons, and training to him and his men. Who then, 15 years later, masterminded 9/11 and the Twin Towers. But yeah, he was one of the people we actually helped and supported in the 80s. Why? Not because he was a good guy, because he was anti-communist. He was anti-Soviet. So we supported him because we often did this. The CIA often did this. The U.S. government often did this in the world. We often supported bad dudes. And it's pretty much always dudes. I can't even think of an example of a bad female leader. I'm sure they existed, but I can't think of one. And we always supported these guys who were sometimes evil, bad dudes. They themselves, killers even. But we supported them because they were anti-communist. So we chose to side with bad people many times during the Cold War because we consider the Soviet Union worse. Anyway, military withdrawal from Eastern Europe, Afghanistan. Removing the Soviet troops. This really happens in the late 80s. And this, of course, is the end of the Soviet Union. It brings it down. George Kennan, he was an ambassador to Moscow, Soviet Union Moscow, back in the 1950s. I think it was 50s. He was an American ambassador to the Soviet Union, and he made a comment. He said something to the effect of, and he wrote I'm sure he wrote a whole documents and papers about this, and he said to the effect, the only way to stop the Soviet Union is basically to control it, contain it. I don't even use that in any of the slides anywhere, but this was known as containment, the containment strategy. If we contain the Soviet Union, it will eventually collapse. That was what Kennan said. He believed this. he was right. Thing is, it took 45 years. Which is nothing funny about it, but it took 45 years, but he was right. We did fight Soviet Union everywhere they went in the world. Oftentimes we didn't succeed, but we still slowed their advancement and we stopped them any chance we could, and eventually the Soviet Union collapses in upon itself. It does eventually fall. It just, I don't know if Kennan ever put a timetable on it when he wrote these documents about how containing the Soviet Union will eventually collapse it. I don't know how long he thought it would take, but it took about 45 years. The Velvet Revolutions. All this leads us to basically the fall of the Soviet Union, which was primarily bloodless. It actually was. There was this conflict, and I'm sure people died, but we don't see any real major wars or conflicts here. The Soviet Union just sort of falls apart. Poland was first. We see the election of John Paul II. He became the head of the Catholic Church. He became the Pope. He was Polish. He demonstrated to the world and the Polish people that even oppressed people, Poland still oppressed under the Iron Curtain. They hadn't relinquished their religious identity. We see increased courage. We see increased pushing. We see increased revolutionary talk, increased independence talk, Polish identity. There was a movement called the Solidarity Movement, which challenges the Polish government, which actually legalizes this solidarity movement, allows free elections to take place, and this movement becomes the first elected non-communist democratic leaders in Poland in the late 80s. And the Soviets don't stop it. Now, the Soviets were influencing the government, and the government finally allows this to happen. They authorize it. The Solidarity basically becomes a political party, and John Paul II was very outspoken about this. He actually was criticized by many because he used it as a religious talking point, saying the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe was actually stifling religious freedom, which it was. And he used this as an argument to basically, he said, it allowed him to speak about it. Because normally religious leaders, like the Pope, for instance, did not usually get involved in this geopolitics. That really was not supposed to be the purview of the Pope. But the Pope believed he had a right and a place to step in because what the Soviet Union was doing was stifling religious freedoms all across Eastern Europe and had been for most of the century, which was true. And so he thought it was his place to basically intervene and say something and to make it very public that he believed the Catholic Church stood for freedom, which was anti-communist. And so this does help push some of these movements because there were a lot of Catholics in Europe. Eastern Europe had a lot of Catholics, and so we see this movement, sort of this pro-Catholic, anti-communist movement coalescing in Poland, and Poland basically elects these free democratic leaders that then call for independence and total freedom and a breakaway from the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia has a revolution, a peaceful revolution. They remove the communist leaders, led to the election of Václav Havel, which is thought to be their first democratically elected leader. Now, these are not full-on democracies as we think of here. They're still, it isn't like overnight you flip a switch and it's like a full freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of everything, all their rights protected, etc., etc. It didn't happen overnight. But these are really dramatic shifts from incredibly oppressive, authoritarian governments that basically took marching orders from Moscow that are no longer taking orders from Moscow. They are moving towards freedom and independence and some form of democracy and representative government. Romania, we do see a bloody revolution. We see the communist government refusing to relent, the communist government refusing to back down, and so we see an actual bloody revolt. Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife are executed. We see thousands of people die. We see an armed revolt. Ceausescu really was really bad. He enjoyed the power he received as an authoritarian leader, sort of with the protection of Moscow. And so he was brutal and violent and killed thousands of his own citizens to basically repress and push down revolts and riots and thousands of people put in prison and killed, and eventually the society rises up and he's captured, and him and his wife are executed as basically criminals against the state. And Romania moves into a democratic elections, I believe the following year. Hungary, they tore down the barbed wire barrier that isolated them from Austria. We see a path for East Germans who wanted to reach West Germany and basically go from East Germany through Austria into West Germany, and then they could then escape into the West for freedom. And we see free elections in Hungary as well shortly after that. East Germany, their communist leaders, they open the Berlin Wall. Very shortly after opening the Berlin Wall, the people actually start tearing it down. They physically start tearing it down with sledgehammers. Shortly after the gates are opened and the guard towers the soldiers with machine guns are taken down from the guard towers, gates are opened, and then the people on both sides start to actually tear the wall down, physically tear it down to allow for new elections. We see free elections, and within like a year, we see East and West Germany united by 1991 into a united single Germany under a democratic government. What is most amazing about this, the bloodless part of it, yes, is amazing. In almost all these countries, basically, have democratic revolutions with relatively little bloodshed, with the exception there of Romania. But even the revolution itself wasn't that bloody. The stuff Ceausescu did was terrible. Ceausescu killed far more than people died in the actual revolution. But what was probably most amazing how quickly this happened. Almost all of Eastern Europe became independent within 18 months. Within an 18-month period, we basically see Soviet communism swept out of Eastern Europe, and generally quasi-democratic or quasi-democratic representative governments freely elected, all from 89 to 91. Once the Soviet Union cracked and it started to fall apart, it just imploded. It just fell apart. Kennan had it right. It just took a long time for it to manifest. And we get West German democracy. Fall of the Berlin Wall here. It was international. It was one of the, there was I forget who did this exactly, but there's some type of a news organization that, I can't remember exactly. It's been years since I read it, but one of the greatest moments in world history. This is considered to be one of the 100 greatest moments in world history, the fall of the Berlin Wall, because it represents the end of communist control of Eastern Europe and the victory of democracy, what the U.S. had been fighting for half a century, and other Western countries had been fighting for half a century, and of course, the millions upon millions that lived in oppressive, violent, authoritarian governments in Eastern Europe. Now, people live in these governments around the world today. There's lots of authoritarian governments in the world today. But, if we ever see a day that comes when North Korea's government falls, for instance, and North Korean citizens get to actually have free democratic elections, and who knows when or if that'll happen, but if that day ever comes, I think that will be one of the greatest days in history, too. Something like that. And that's something that we could see possibly in our lifetime. We could see happen today, since this is well beyond, most students. This happened long before many of you watching this were even alive. So, but the idea is, there is something comparable we could see today that we could maybe see that happen. We could see something like that happen. Or maybe even the modern communist Russian government after Vladimir Putin. Maybe something changes when he leaves office or dies or is assassinated. Who knows? Yeah, who knows? Fall of the Berlin Wall, it suggests a popular movement, people wanting to bring down the wall, what the wall represented. We see the people in this picture. You see men and women. It is mostly men, interestingly enough. It does seem to appear mostly men. We see them wearing regular clothes. They're not soldiers, they're not politicians. This is the people. This is the people bringing down what had become a sign for almost 40 years 30 years of oppression, violence, authoritarian, censorship, restrictions of freedom of speech and press, freedom of thought. That's what this wall all came to represent. Yeah, a victory over tyranny. Even represents the way people did this, and I guess the idea of them straddling the wall was supposed to make a message, sort of bringing the two sides together, the East and the West, the Germans, East and West Germany, sort of victory of one over the other, or maybe not over one over the other, maybe bringing them together, being able to cross the wall and be on both sides, which you had not really been able to be on both sides of this wall for 30 years. On one side was one type of people, and the other side was another type of people. And geopolitically, they had been enemies for, again, 30 years. East German leaders opened the wall, but they only did it because they had to. They didn't do it because they wanted to. East German communist leaders didn't do this because they wanted to. They were forced. And what really helped happen was the fact that Hungary and Austria did what they did. This was almost like a dominoes thing. For some of you might even be familiar with dominoes. You have the dominoes, each one standing up, one falls over and hits the other, hits the other, hits the other, and hits the other, and then they all fall down. With Poland doing what it did, that leads to Austria and Hungary doing what they did, which allowed which sort of forced East Germany to do what it did. So a lot of these countries really just took one or two to really stand up, throw off the Soviet control, and just saying, we're going to move forward. But the thing is, that required the people and the government. In most of these velvet revolutions, velvet meaning soft, not bloody, most of these soft velvet revolutions, we actually see them finding a way to work together, the people and the government, to move into more of a democratic government and push off the Soviet communism. That was required. We needed a couple governments to do that, to really stand up, a combination of lower and upper class working together, and then it just sort of dominoes fell. And it coalesces here. Well, it really ultimately coalesces in December 25th, 1991, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The end of the Cold War and Soviet disintegration. 22 nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, sent representatives to Paris and agreed to reduce military strength, reduce military strength, military aggression, military, I'm trying to think what the word is. Doesn't come to mind. The bluster, basically when you're like, you puff in your chest up, like, yeah, we're tough, we're going to be tough, and we'll do whatever we have to do, and, don't push us, and we'll have to take action or respond. Basically, it was all about trying to lower the tensions, lower the military tensions, to lower the aggression between East and West, to try to find a more path forward that didn't constantly always devolve into the potential for nuclear obliteration. To recognize borders, to declare an end to confrontation and division. The treaty was eventually identified as the Charter of Paris. It called for a new Europe, the end of the 45-year Cold War, and the U.S., and in another part of this, the U.S. and the Soviets agreed to a 30% across-the-board reduction in military arms. To basically reduce military arms and production and weapon stores, including nuclear weapons, across the board, both countries, to try and reduce tensions. Because we saw an inordinate amount of warfare in the 80s. Eastern Europe, Africa, the Middle East, South America. We saw a lot of warfare, a lot of these proxy wars going around the world. And more weapons, more and more technology. And of course we have nuclear capabilities to blow the entire world into oblivion several times over. This treaty basically ends the Cold War, basically. Boris Yeltsin, who is Gorbachev's political rival, he declares Russian independent. He actually pulls Russia out of the USSR, declares independence. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic effectively ends on December 25th, 1991, as it dissolved. It sort of goes out with a whimper, not a bang. All kinds of negotiations, all kinds of treaties. For a while there, it appeared as though everybody on both sides looked around and said, wow, what have we been doing? What have we been doing for all these years? We've basically been building bigger and better ways to destroy ourselves and everyone else in the world. And all this bluster and all this anger and all this frustration and all this pushing back and forth. Some people had a couple years here where it seemed like everyone sort of got their head on right and realized this couldn't continue like this. And it just sort of ends. Democracy comes to take hold in much of Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain falls, the wall falls, Russia declares independence, and the rest of those other parts of the Soviet Union, all those other countries basically become independent over the next couple of years. And we end up all together, from 89 to 95, you end up with about 15 new countries. 15, 16 brand new independent countries, many of them with democratic leaning or democratic governments. And this is a map, so you just take a quick look at it, just sort of see what we see happens here. Russian Federation. You get Georgia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, all the different stands. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And then this doesn't really include Eastern European countries, which all became independent, basically became independent countries. These are all countries that become independent that had been part of the Soviet Union. So yeah, you end up with something like 16. I say new, they're not, these are relatively new. These are basically new states. But those Eastern European countries, those aren't new, but they're newly independent. And what is really interesting is most of these do actually become democratic leaning or democratic countries, which is really great. All right, that's the end of this one. So thanks. We'll see you next time.